Okay, last time we got clear about what speakers of English mean when we use the word poetry to refer to a kind of literature. We mean a text that has one or more of the following properties: a certain typography, a certain arrangement of the words on the page, wide margins, varying margins, sometimes a space between groups of lines, sometimes also the first line of the poem printed above the entire text of the poem as its title. Second, a text which is called a poem or appears in a book called poems. Third, when spoken aloud or imagined being spoken aloud, the words have unusual sounds. And fourth, we have in mind a text that displays some kind of unusual linguistic usage. We also claim that Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud is poetry. It is literature of this kind. And we justified that claim by observing that this text has all of the properties we have in mind when we are thinking of poetry or using the word poetry to designate a kind of literature. At the conclusion of last session, I also claimed that I and many others over the last 200 or 300 years, 200 years, feel that this text is not just any old poem or instance of poetry, it's special. It has certain merits. It achieves certain things. It has a particular value and significance for us. So in this session, I want to explain why this is so, but also to suggest more generally the kind of pleasure and enjoyment other poetry can give to us now. So one of the main reasons this poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, has been felt to be special and continues to be thought so, is that it can serve as the occasion for a wide range of experiences when we read or hear it read aloud. What kinds of experience? Well, I want to identify the first kind of experience I have in mind, the kind of experience the poem can provide to us, by recalling a passage from a wonderful 18th century poet, Alexander Pope, who in 1711 published a work called An Essay on Criticism, in which he writes the following. But most, he's speaking of readers and critics here, but most by numbers judge a poet's song, and smooth or rough with them is right or wrong. In the bright muse, though thousand charms conspire, her voice is all these tuneful fools admire, who haunt Parnassus but to please their ear, not mend their minds, as some to church repair, not for the doctrine, but the music there. Now, in these lines, Pope observes that many readers and critics, indeed most of them, read merely in order to experience the pleasure of hearing the sounds of words, and they don't really care about understanding the words or improving their minds. He observes that just as some people go to church merely in order for the pleasures of hearing the music there, so these readers read merely for the pleasure of hearing the sounds of the words. Now, Pope is not saying that the pleasure of hearing the sounds of words is unimportant. He's just critical of those readers who focus solely on that, to the exclusion of what those words mean, to the exclusion of bringing their mind into play when they read poetry. Now, in so doing, and making this observation, I think Pope does indicate that hearing the sounds of words just in and of themselves, in and of itself, the experience of hearing the sound of words can be a pleasurable experience. Now, I want to read the first two stanzas of Wordsworth's poem aloud again and ask you to attend to the sounds of the words and your own experience of hearing those sounds. Listen. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. Now let me ask you, was that a pleasurable experience? Was just hearing the sounds of the words enjoyable? I want to suggest to you that, at least for some of us, that experience can be an enjoyable, pleasurable experience. For me, at least, the sound, there's something about the sound. It's gentle and soft and regular in such a way that it soothes me. It provides the pleasures, the enjoyment of being soothed and relaxed. And that's a pleasurable experience for me. And I want to suggest to you that that is one of the achievements of the poem. It can be an occasion for us to have a certain kind of sensual enjoyment of sensation, in particular hearing. Now, another kind of enjoyable experience that I think Wordsworth's poem may provide to some of us is indicated by what many of his readers have observed about his poetry in general. One early reviewer of it, for example, said he was happy, quote, to gaze on his mellow pictures of simple happiness and affection. And in his autobiography, the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill claimed that one of the reasons he enjoyed and valued Wordsworth's poetry so highly was that, quote, it placed before me beautiful pictures of natural scenery, unquote. Now, I think that this can be said of Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. There's something about the way Wordsworth describes this landscape that gives some of us, at least, a strong, vivid, graphic, forceful image or picture of the scene that he describes. A great number of daffodils swaying in the breeze on the shores of the lake. And that having that image of that scene can be an enjoyable, pleasurable experience as well. Now, a third kind of experience, which I think the poem can generate in us, is a kind of intellectual interest, something that Pope was thinking of when he refers to engagement of the mind, which is something Pope thinks ought to happen when we read good poetry. I think we can, the poem, Wordsworth's poem can generate in us this type of intellectual activity, intellectual interest, a mental excitement, thinking, reflection about human experience. Now, you might wonder how that could be so, since at least on the surface, it looks just like a silly poem about flowers by a lake. Surely that silly little poem about flowers couldn't engage our mind in this way. But notice that really, besides describing a scene, Wordsworth also gives us an account of his experience of perceiving that scene. He describes, we might say he narrates, how he was wandering by a lake and saw flowers on the shore, but he also observes that at the time he saw those flowers, he really was unaware of something important. When he saw the flowers, he little thought what wealth the show to me had brought, he says. That is to say, at the time of perception, he did not know how significant or valuable that experience would be to him after he had it. In the final stanza of the poem, he gives a reason for this observation, that he really was unaware of the significance of the experience of perception at the time of that experience. For, right, that word for indicating he's going now to provide a reason for his observation that he just made about his being unaware of something at the time of the perception. For oft when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. Wordsworth claims that on several occasions after he had perceived the flowers by the lake, when he has been alone, he has remembered that scene. At least the scene has flashed upon his inward eye. And he observes that that experience of remembered perception made him happy and continues to do so. So though it might look at first glance like a silly little poem about flowers, it really is about much more than that. It's a description of a natural scene, yes, but it's also an account of the experience of seeing, of perceiving, sensory perception of that scene. And it is, in addition, the poem also presents observations about the nature of sensory perception and memories of sensory perception. Now, I know that these things might be of little interest to some people, and they might well dismiss the poem without ever thinking about it again. But I dare say that at least some people are interested in this kind of thing, in the green world, in their perceptions of it, and they're concerned with memories of their experiences in the green world. And at least for them, the poem may well be of some interest. It may well be an occasion for them to think about and reflect upon the kind of experience Wordsworth describes, to consider whether or not that experience Wordsworth describes is true to their own experience. So I think that another thing that makes the poem special and that underlies its significance and value for some readers is that it is an occasion for other pleasures of the mind, for thinking, for a kind of mental excitement and intellectual interest, for reflection about human existence and experience, for reflection about our experience in the green world, the world of nature. Finally, I think the poem is special, even successful in a way, because it can cause us to have another type of experience, emotional experience. What kind of emotional experience? Well, for another 19th century poet, the experience of joy. Here is what Matthew Arnold has to say about Wordsworth's poetry. Wordsworth's poetry, Arnold writes in a preface that he wrote to a collection of Wordsworth's poetry. Wordsworth's poetry is great because of the extraordinary power with which Wordsworth feels the joy offered to us in nature. The joy offered to us in the simple primary affections and duties, and because of the extraordinary power with which, in case after case, he shows us this joy and renders it so as to make us share it. Arnold thinks Wordsworth's poetry is great and valuable. That is because it not only shows what Wordsworth is feeling, his joy, but also because it causes us to share in that joy. It causes reading Wordsworth's poetry is an occasion for us to feel the joy that Wordsworth himself feels, to share in that joy, to feel an emotion, in particular joy. For John Stuart Mill, whom I mentioned earlier, something of the same. It's great. He's got this autobiography in which he describes how he had this period of depression. He was really down, depressed, and he describes how, in order to deal with that depression, he just picked up some poetry by Wordsworth and started reading it. And he observes how this really healed him and enabled him to regain some happiness and joy in life. Here's a passage where he's talking about this. Wordsworth would never have had any great effect on me if he had merely placed before me beautiful pictures of natural scenery, which is one of the things that Wordsworth's poetry does. But for Mill, that's not the main thing. What made Wordsworth's poems a medicine for my state of mind was that they expressed not mere outward beauty, but states of feeling and of thought colored by feeling under the excitement of beauty. They seemed to be the very culture of the feelings which I was in quest of. In them I seemed to draw from a source of inward joy, of sympathetic and imaginative pleasure which could be shared in by all human beings. From them I seemed to learn what would be the perennial sources of happiness when all the greater evils of life shall have been removed. And I felt myself at once better and happier as I came under their influence. I long continued to value Wordsworth by the measure of what he had done for me. John Stuart Mill, in his autobiography, saying something similar to what Arnold says. They both value the poetry in part because of the way it makes them feel, because it can function as an occasion for them to have emotional experiences, positive emotional experiences, in particular, joy. I too feel a kind of joy when I read the poem, especially when I read the poem aloud to other people in class. I read this poem several times teaching first-year university, and it's quite amazing. I find it difficult to contain my emotions when I read it. I find it I am moved. I get a little teary-eyed, a little choked up. I have a feeling of joy, yes, a kind of delight and happiness, but it's also mingled with a little melancholy, perhaps also a little awe and reverence. Complicated emotional experience, but I am among those who find that the poem is an occasion for some kind of enjoyable emotional experience. So at least one of the main things that makes I Wandered Lonely as a Crowd special and valuable to us is that it can serve as an occasion, it can be an occasion for a wide range of experiences, for the pleasure of hearing sound, the pleasure of imagining things, of visualizing things, of seeing something in our mind's eye. It can be an occasion for us to see the landscape Wordsworth is describing, to imagine it. Also, the poem can, right, because of what the poem is about, it can be an occasion for us to reflect upon human experience, reflect on how to live, reflect upon the value that particular experiences can have for us. And finally, the poem can function as an occasion for us to have certain emotional experiences, joy, but also perhaps a little melancholy, perhaps some gratitude, perhaps some wonder and awe and reverence, as I will observe as we go along. So that is my answer to the question of what is good about Wordsworth's poem, this poem in particular. What is good is that it can provide us, it can serve as an occasion for us to have a wide range of experiences which we might not have otherwise, right? Which you can't get from doing other things or reading other kinds of text. Now, I want to make a few additional comments on this before we finish for now. I'm not saying that the poem affects you in this way, nor that you should feel these things or have these experiences when they read the poem. And indeed, Wordsworth knew that even in his own time, many people, many of his readers would not have these experiences when they read him. In 1798, Wordsworth and his friend Samuel Coleridge published a book of poems called Lyrical Ballads, which contained poems by both of them. And Wordsworth wrote a preface for the republication of this collection in 1800. And he revised that preface for publication of Lyrical Ballads in 1802. Now, it's really good. I find it an amazing observation about 19th century, early 19th century English society. Because in that preface, Wordsworth observes that many people have a craving for extraordinary incident, quote, end quote, a craving for outrageous stimulation. And that craving for outrageous stimulation and extraordinary incident was gratified by what Wordsworth refers to as the rapid communication of intelligence. by which I think he has in mind periodicals and newspapers, of which there were many at that time. He felt that, right, because this news in the form of newspapers and periodicals was continually gratifying the craving for extraordinary incident, people were becoming degraded, and they were reduced to a state of, quote, savage torpor, unquote, which rendered them pretty much incapable of having the experiences that I have just described in connection with his poem. Isn't it amazing that Wordsworth is observing this about a print culture? I mean, he hadn't seen the digital age, which gratifies our craving for outrageous incident even more, I would say, than print culture did. So perhaps we too are, I have to admit that I think I too am reduced a little bit, at least to a state of savage torpor, by continually gratifying my craving for incident and news on the internet. Nevertheless, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud has been an occasion for those experiences I've mentioned, for some of those who have gone before us. It still is an occasion for readers, I include myself, however reduced I may be as a result of aspects of our information age, the digital age, but it still is an occasion for me, and I think many others, for those kinds of special experience that I mentioned. And I want to say that one of the main sources of the poem's achievement and value for us now lies in its ability to be an occasion for those experiences. Now, second, it doesn't just happen to be the case that this poem can be an occasion for us to have these experiences. In the preface and elsewhere, Wordsworth claims that he writes and publishes, at least in part, with the intention that his readers have these experiences. In the preface, he says, and in many of his poems, Wordsworth associates poetry with music and the pleasure we derive from hearing the sounds of music. He speaks of, quote, the music of harmonious metrical language, unquote, and makes clear that he writes and publishes with the aim of providing those pleasures to his reader. In the preface, Wordsworth also says he's concerned with objects that are vividly described. That is to say, one of the things he also is trying to do is to give us an image of what he describes. And in the preface, he's quite emphatic on this point. He's writing poetry not about recondite things, rare things, things that most people don't care about or experience or think about. He emphasizes that he's trying to write poetry about things that are, quote, interesting and important to many people, things that are common. And because they are common, they are interesting and important to people. He says he's also trying to write about those things so that his poetry will be interesting and important to his readers. And finally, he is most emphatic on the point that one of his main purposes in writing and publishing poetry is to cause his readers to have an emotional experience, to experience passion and emotion. So it doesn't just happen to be the case that I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud and other Wordsworth poems can cause us to have these experiences. Wordsworth is writing with the intention, that's one of his principal intentions, one of his purposes and aims in writing. And insofar as we do have those experiences, we could say that Wordsworth succeeds in writing poetry of the kind he is writing. Now, a third point I want to make has to do with subjectivity. You might be thinking that if we think of the achievement of poetry in terms of how it affects us, that makes achievement and value subjective. You might think that there's therefore really no good reason to value one poem over another, right? Because it's just a matter of how it makes us feel, and that's subjective. Now, I think this is a mistake. I think there's a general kind of aversion to feeling and experience, which really prevents us from understanding the achievements of poetry. Think about the merit and achievement of a medicine or medication. We assess the merit and value and achievement of a particular medicine or medication, at least in part, by the way it affects us. If it has a beneficial effect with no side effects, then the effect that it is intended to have, we think it is a valuable medicine, a good medicine, an effective medicine. Now, just as it is reasonable, I want to draw an analogy, one that some of Wordsworth's readers, such as Mill, draw. Just as it is reasonable to assess the achievement or value or goodness of a medication, at least in part on the grounds of how it affects the patient, so it is reasonable to assess the value and goodness of a poem, at least in part on grounds of how it affects readers. Yes, it's going to affect readers in lots of different ways, but that doesn't mean it is illegitimate to evaluate the quality or success or value of a poem, at least in part on grounds of how it affects readers. Finally, one of the aims of this course is to promote our enjoyment of poetry. And one way I'm attempting to achieve this aim is simply by attending to two things. First, Wordsworth wrote and published this poem with the intention of providing us with certain kinds of enjoyable, pleasurable experiences. And many readers have, in fact, had such experiences. Now, you still might not enjoy Wordsworth's poetry, even if you know that. But I want to encourage you, I want to encourage us to approach poetry, this poem and other poetry, in a certain way, not as it is commonly approached in our schools, namely as an object to be interpreted. What does it mean? This is what it means. Okay, we're done for today. No. Let's approach the poem as an occasion for experiences. And let's think of the experiences that we have as we read the poem as things that are relevant to the poem's achievement and significance that it can have for us. Let's not think of I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud as a riddle or a puzzle simply to be solved or put together or interpreted. Let's think of it as an occasion for enjoyable experience. And if we approach it in this way, I think we may well begin to have those experiences. Now, one of the other aims of the course is to understand what it is about the language of the poem that accounts for its power to provide us with these experiences. What is it about the language of the poem that enables that poem, that text, to affect us in all of these ways? Now, in the next session, we will begin to answer that question.